discussion to rise in their places, and I call the member for McMahon.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Well, the Australian people know a desperate con job when they see it, and certainly they saw one last night. And certainly they saw more desperation at question time today. A desperate attempt to distract from the failings of this awful government. Now, I've got a tip for the government. I've got a tip for the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. If you want people to forget that you're making them work until they're 70 before they can get the age pension, drop the policy. If you want people to forget that you're going to take $14 a fortnight off pensioners and recipients of New Start, drop the policy. But of course, both of those policies are at the centrepiece of their budget delivered last night. They remain government policy. And I'll tell you what else remains government policy. They've got to find the money from somewhere to pay for their corporate tax cuts. That's why those measures and other measures remain in the budget, and I dare say we may hear more about this from the honourable member for Jagga. But if you want people to forget that you're giving billions of dollars away to big business in Australia, maybe the way to do it is not to hide how much it's costing. That's what they're just attempting to do. Hide from pensioners, hide from people across Australia how much they're giving away in corporate tax cuts. We know they know. Of course they know they know. I mean, the Treasurer is pretty incompetent, but I grant him this. He knows how much his corporate tax cuts cost, but he just won't tell the Australian people. Remember when they first introduced the corporate tax cuts and we asked them how much it costs over 10 years? It took a few goes. Eventually we found out it was $50 billion. And then a year later we had to ask again, and it was a bit easier. We found out it was $65 billion. We asked today, and it's back to being very hard to find out because it's an embarrassing figure, Mr Deputy Speaker, an embarrassing figure. And the other part of their plan to try and get the Australian people to forget all their policies which impact on workers, on pensioners, on recipients of government payments, is to offer them a tax cut. They say, look at this, we've got a tax cut for the Australian people. When will that tax cut, the big tax cut, take effect? 2024, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, this is a Treasurer who last year stood at the dispatch box at the budget and in all seriousness very earnestly argued that Australians had to pay more tax, told us that we had to pay more tax to fund the National Disability Scheme, told us that it was absolutely essential for every Australian who earns more than $21,000 to pay more income tax. Anybody who dared oppose the tax was told that they were being unreasonable, obstructionist, cynical, opportunistic. We were even told we were being un-Australian, Mr Deputy Speaker, just 12 months ago. And of course this year the Treasurer pops up and says, you know all that stuff I said last year about a personal income tax rise? Scrub it. Not necessary. Don't need it anymore. Oops, got that wrong. This is the guy who tells us he knows what's going to happen in 7 years' time. He's got a plan to give us a tax cut in 7 years' time when he couldn't keep one policy from one budget to the other. I mean, Mr Deputy Speaker, I dare say you don't know what you'll be doing in 7 years' time. I don't know exactly what I'll be doing in 7 years' time. I hope to be standing there, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've got a daughter who's just started high school, Mr Deputy Speaker. She'll hopefully be at uni in 7 years' time. I've got a son in primary school. He might be doing the HSC in 7 years' time. And what we don't know, Mr Deputy Speaker, is exactly what the budget will be doing or the economy will be doing in 7 years' time. But I must say, long-term planning and consistency from this government in economic policy isn't their strong point. I mean, the guys who bring you a tax cut in 2024 are the same guys who bought you state income taxes. State income taxes. Now that lasted not 7 years, it lasted 2 days, Mr Deputy Speaker, as government policy. And they brought us GST to pay for personal income tax cuts. Now, that was a long-lived policy by this government standard. That lasted 6 months. And now we're told they've got a plan which lasts for 7 years, all on the basis of the Prime Minister being re-elected twice over that 7-year period. Now, I'm not sure the member for Wentworth will be leader of the Liberal Party in 7 weeks, Mr Deputy Speaker, let alone 7 years, but he's told us to trust him. They've got a 7-year plan. But what does that 7-year plan cost? What does that 7-year plan cost? What are the different elements of that 7-year plan cost? Is anybody in the House any the wiser after an hour of question time as to what the 7-year plan costs? I mean, talk about budget responsibility. How dare this parliament ask what the cost is of a plan we were told, even as early as this morning, we should vote upon immediately. We should vote upon no questions asked. They've got a deal for us. They've got a deal for the Australian people. Down at Malcolm and Scott's car yard, Mr Deputy Speaker, a tax cut in 7 years, but don't ask any details. Don't ask any tricky questions that involve numbers or dollar signs, Mr Deputy Speaker, because they don't want to tell us. Again, I give the Treasurer this much credit. He knows the answer. He just doesn't want to tell us because the answer is not particularly convenient. Now, of course, there are also tax cuts as on the 1st of July this year. Somebody under $37,000 a year will receive $4 a week. Somebody earning between $48,000 and $90,000 a year will receive $10 a week. Now, with wages growth at record lows, with penalty rates being cut and somebody working on the weekend losing $77 a week, with private health insurance rebates, premiums going up, with electricity costs going up, of course these tax cuts are warranted. And of course they will be supported by this parliament. They'll be supported on that side of the House and this side of the House. But I say this, Mr Deputy Speaker, through you. How about you put it to a vote? We want to see those tax cuts implemented, and we put to you, why don't you let us vote on those tax cuts? We want to see those tax cuts delivered to the Australian people on the 1st of July, and it would be an act of outrageous cynicism if you held those tax cuts hostage to your hoax of a tax cut in 2024. If you said, we won't give you a tax cut in 2018 because we can't get our plans for a tax cut in 2024 through the parliament because the opposition, those terrible, pesky opposition, dares ask questions about those tax cuts. Now, I note that they're doing it through a rebate, Mr Deputy Speaker, the low and middle income earners tax rebate. And I note in passing in the budget that that rebate is non-refundable. A non-refundable rebate being introduced into the tax system, i.e. you can get your tax bill down to zero, but you can't get tax refunds after that. Amazing. And a principle which is pretty consistent through the Tax Act, I must say, Mr Deputy Speaker, with one exception, dividend imputation. So it's good enough for low-income earners, good enough for middle-income earners to have a non-refundable rebate, but for those people on high incomes who don't pay income tax, they must get a refundable tax concession. They must get cheques even if they haven't paid income tax. It says all about the priorities of this government, all about the priorities. Now, the bravado of this government, which says that they will provide tax cuts in 2024 as their big economic answer, talking of the tax cuts, talking of implementing those tax cuts when they won't tell the Australian people the cost, while proceeding with the plan to make Australians work until they're 70. Now, I gave the Treasurer a bit of credit before, saying he would know the answer. He would know the answer in relation to the cost of the tax cuts. But that's where my generosity ends, I have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, because an important part of this debate is the government's plan to make Australians work until they're 70. And rubbish! Rubbish!
That's exactly what they're doing.
But the Treasurer didn't say it was rubbish last night. The Treasurer didn't say it was rubbish last night when he was asked about the plan to make Australians work till they're 70, which has been in the budget papers since 2014 and is still in the budget papers, still in the budget. But the Treasurer was asked last night about the plan to make Australians work until they're 70, and he said, wait for it, he said, but that doesn't happen for 35 years, he said. For 35 years, the Treasurer said, that plan doesn't get implemented for the next 35 years. Well, it starts in 2025. That's not 35 years away. The Treasurer doesn't know the impact of his own policies. He thinks they're not going to make this policy work for 35 years, when in fact it is working in 2025 and will be fully implemented a few years after that, Mr Deputy Speaker. The pension age is going up on your watch, and not in 35 years' time. Not in 35 years' time, Mr Deputy Speaker. It starts going up in 2025, and that's not 35 years away. That is not 35 years away. But I'll tell you what, Mr Deputy Speaker, there's a lot of inconsistencies, there's a lot of illogic, there's a lot of unfairness in this budget. That's been the hallmark of all the budgets since 2014, since that famous Joe Hockey budget in 2014. That's the one, and it's still alive in 2018. It lives, Mr Deputy Speaker, and just as we defeated that budget, we'll defeat you at the next election.